A weary rancher knocked at the wrong door. A widow's child gasped, eyes wide with tears, whispering the word he never expected to hear, "Papa." From that moment, nothing would be the same. Jonah Carver had lived his life by the rhythm of cattle hooves and the lonely silence of wide plains. His days were long, his nights even longer, and though neighbors spoke kindly of him, they also whispered that Jonah carried a heaviness that no man could set down. He had buried his kin too early and too often, and the land had swallowed every joy he once believed was his. That night, under a low sky heavy with storm clouds, he rode through the dark trying to return from town, his saddle aching against him and his lantern casting a narrow glow across the wet earth. He had taken the wrong fork in the road hours earlier, though he did not know it yet. The storm broke loose with rain that cut like needles and winds that drove the trees into a wild sway. Jonah cursed his poor judgment silently, not with words but with the groan of a man who had been left alone one too many times. He urged his horse onward, squinting against the torrent until at last he spotted a faint light ahead. Relief caught his breath. A house, tucked among trees, smoke twisting faintly from its chimney. Shelter. He had never seen the place before, but he did not question it. His bones rattled with cold, and he needed warmth. He dismounted, boots sloshing into mud, and staggered to the door. He knocked, firm but weary, expecting perhaps an old farmer, a family at supper, or even a stranger with a rifle ready. Instead, he heard the patter of small feet. The door creaked open just wide enough for lamplight to spill across his face, and in that light stood a child, a little boy with hair tousled and cheeks flushed from fire's warmth. The boy froze, staring up at Jonah as though struck by lightning. His eyes widened with disbelief, his lips trembling before he whispered, "Papa, you finally came back." The words tore through Jonah's chest like a blade. He blinked, stunned, rain dripping from his hat brim, breath caught between denial and the strange ache of recognition. He began, but the boy's arms were already around him, thin little arms clutching with a desperate strength that Jonah hadn't felt in years. Behind the child's voice came another, sharper and trembling, "Samuel, who's at the door?" A woman appeared in the doorway. Her dark dress was patched but neat, her face pale with strain yet framed by strength that had clearly been carved from years of sorrow. Her eyes, when they found Jonah, shifted instantly from suspicion to shock. She staggered a half-step forward as if the world had tilted beneath her feet. "Jonah," she whispered. He stiffened. "Ma'am, you must be mistaken, But she pressed a hand to her lips, trembling, eyes glassed with tears. "No, it can't be. The boy clung tighter, pressing his face into Jonah's drenched coat. "Mama, Papa came back. I told you he would." Jonah's breath faltered. He wanted to pull away, to explain, to tell them that fate had delivered him here by error. But the boy's warmth seeped into his chest, and the widow's tears caught in the lamplight like something holy. For one terrible, fleeting moment, he wondered if God had played some strange mercy on him, returning him to a family he never had. The storm howled behind him, urging him inside, yet his feet stayed rooted at the threshold. His heart pounded with questions that had no answers. Who had this woman mistaken him for? Whose place had he stumbled into? And more terrifying, why did the child's arms feel like they were meant to be there all along? He swallowed, struggling against the pull in his soul. "Ma'am," he managed, his voice low and rough, "I don't rightly know what." The widow's knees nearly buckled. She caught herself on the doorframe, whispering again, almost in prayer, "It's really you." The storm raged louder, drowning the silence that pressed between them. Jonah realized with a chill that he could not simply turn back to the night, not with the boy's grip around his waist, not with the widow's eyes locked on him as though she'd seen a ghost return to flesh. Inside, the fire crackled, spilling warmth and the scent of bread that pulled at his hunger. Outside, the storm promised only misery and danger, but stepping across that threshold felt like more than entering a house. It felt like entering a lie he did not know if he had the strength to break. And still Samuel's voice echoed in his ears. "Papa, you finally came back." Jonah's heart thundered. His life had been built on silence and loss, but tonight something had shifted. He had stumbled into another man's place, another man's history, and perhaps, God help him, into another man's family. He knew he should speak the truth before another word was said. Yet as he opened his mouth, thunder shook the land, the boy pressed tighter, and the widow's eyes begged him for something he wasn't sure he could give. The storm was not the only thing threatening to swallow Jonah Carver whole. The firelight drew Jonah across the threshold before his conscience could stop him. His boots left muddy prints on the wood floor, each step feeling heavier, as though every board knew he was an imposter. Samuel wouldn't let go of his coat, tugging him eagerly toward the hearth with the unshakable certainty that he had found his father. Jonah's heart churned as he glanced at the widow, who hadn't yet moved, her hand still trembling against the doorframe. She looked as though she might faint, yet she refused to take her eyes off him, as if a single blink would erase the impossible sight before her. The room was modest but tidy, an oil lamp set on the table, a half-eaten loaf of bread left beside a knife, 2 wooden cups that still steamed faintly from tea. A blanket lay draped across the rocking chair by the fire, and Jonah could tell at once it was the kind of place where each thread of comfort had been earned with sweat and sacrifice. It was not the home of wealth, but of survival, of love that had persisted even against hunger. He had lived too long among empty walls not to notice the difference. "Sit, Papa," Samuel's voice rang with joy, his little hands patting at the chair near the fire as if he'd been waiting years for this very night. "You're cold. I'll bring you my blanket." The boy darted to the chair and grabbed the wool, dragging it toward Jonah with determination that made his small arms shake. Jonah's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, that might pierce through the mistake before it deepened. But when he turned, he found the widow's eyes still locked on him, her lips parted, breathing as if she had seen resurrection itself. She whispered again, so faint it might have been mistaken for wind, "It's really you." His voice caught. "Ma'am, he started, but she lifted her hand to silence him. Her movements were careful, reverent, as though afraid he might vanish if she moved too quickly. "I thought the grave had kept you," she murmured, tears sliding freely down her cheeks. "Years, Jonah, years I prayed, and here you stand." His head jerked back. She knew his name. Not a guess, not coincidence, his name. Jonah Carver. His mind spun. What manner of cruel trick was this? He had never laid eyes on this woman in his life, yet she spoke as if they had shared vows, as if they had shared a bed, a child, a home. He wanted to deny it outright, to shake his head and tell her she was wrong. But Samuel's hand clutched his sleeve, grounding him with a warmth that rattled his soul. "I think you mistake me," Jonah said at last, voice rough. "I don't." "No," she gasped, stepping forward. Her voice broke as she reached out, trembling fingers brushing his sodden coat. "Don't say it. Don't break this. The Lord would not give me back my husband only to have him deny us." Jonah froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. Husband. The word crashed against him with a weight he wasn't ready to bear. He had no wife. He had buried the chance for such a bond long ago, when the woman he once loved chose another man and left him to his ranch and his solitude. Yet here was this widow, her child clinging to him, swearing he was someone she had lost to death itself. Every instinct screamed to tell the truth, but every part of him that longed for family, every aching bone that had grown weary of silence, wavered, because her tears were not false. The boy's joy was not rehearsed. They believed, with a faith that could crush a man. "Ma'am," Jonah tried again, but his voice faltered when Samuel looked up at him, eyes shining with the purity of a boy who had waited too long for a father. "I knew you'd come back," the boy whispered. "I prayed every night." The widow's voice cracked into a sob, her hands pressing against her face. She shook with the release of years of grief, falling to her knees by the chair as though she could no longer carry the weight of her disbelief. Jonah had seen many kinds of suffering, men dying on the trail, women burying children too small for coffins. But there was something in her collapse that broke through even the walls he had built. She had lived with an absence so profound that his accidental arrival had become salvation. The storm outside lashed the walls, wind clawing at the shutters, rain beating like fists against the roof. Inside, the widow wept. The child clung, and Jonah stood in the center of it all, a stranger in a story not his own. The air pressed tight around him, choking with firelight and expectation. He wanted to step back into the night, to let the storm swallow him rather than this lie, but the boy's voice anchored him. "Don't leave again, Papa, please." And Jonah felt himself break. The hours that followed twisted his soul further. Samuel would not let him go, dragging him by the hand, pointing at drawings on scraps of paper, chattering about how he would show him the fields when morning came. "Mama takes care of everything," Samuel said proudly, "but she said one day Papa would come back to help her. Now you're here." Jonah couldn't answer. He simply listened, letting the boy's voice cover the silence he couldn't fill with truth. Each word Samuel spoke bound him tighter to the lie, until Jonah felt like a thief in God's house, stealing joy that belonged to another. The widow, her name, he soon learned, was Ruth, watched from the table, her tears finally slowing. She spoke little, but her eyes spoke plenty, never straying from Jonah, as though studying each movement, each breath, to assure herself he was real. More than once she reached for his sleeve, just to feel him solid beneath her fingertips. Each time Jonah nearly confessed. Yet each time Samuel's laughter or Ruth's trembling hope sealed his lips shut. But the weight of the lie grew heavier. He excused himself to step outside for air, though the storm still whipped the trees. Rain plastered his hair, lightning split the horizon, but Jonah breathed hard, pressing his hands against the porch railing as if he might steady a ship in violent waters. He had not known what loneliness could drive a man to until this very moment. He had stumbled into another life, and he could not yet bring himself to cut free from it. He closed his eyes and whispered into the rain, "Lord, guide me, show me the truth of this." His voice cracked, low and desperate. "I never asked for this, but don't let me break them more than they already been broken." When he returned inside, Ruth had set more bread on the table. She looked up, offering him a smile so fragile it nearly unraveled him. "Sit, eat. You must be hungry after so long." Her words chilled him. After so long. To her, he was a man who had been gone, not a stranger who had lost his way. To Samuel, he was an answer to prayer. To himself, he was a fraud who had stepped into a lie that felt too real to escape. Jonah sat, breaking the bread in silence. Samuel leaned against him, yawning but refusing to leave his side. Ruth watched him as if the very act of eating was proof that miracles existed, and Jonah chewed slowly, each bite tasting of guilt. He had to tell them, he knew it. Yet with every beat of the firelight the storm grew heavier and the moment to speak slipped further away. Because part of him, deep, buried, shameful, wanted to believe this was not a mistake at all, that somehow God had led him here on purpose. And then as the fire crackled low and Samuel finally drifted to sleep against his arm, Ruth's voice broke the silence. Soft, trembling, dangerous. "Jonah," she whispered, her eyes locked on his. What happened to you all these years?" His breath caught, the bread stuck in his throat, his heart slamming with dread. She was asking for a story he did not have, and the moment had finally come where silence would no longer save him. Jonah's hand froze halfway to his cup, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face as Ruth's question hung heavy in the room. "What happened to you all these years?" Her voice had cracked with both fear and yearning, as if she dreaded the answer yet could not bear to go without it. Samuel's small head rested against Jonah's arm, the boy sleeping soundly after clinging so fiercely, his hand still curled into the fabric of Jonah's coat. Every heartbeat Jonah felt seemed to hammer the same word into his chest, lie, and yet his mouth would not open to release the truth. Ruth's eyes searched his features with desperation, as though every scar, every line, every weary crease in his face might hold the secret of why he had been gone. "I prayed," she whispered, tears gathering once again, shimmering in the lamplight. Every night, Jonah, I prayed the Lord might send you back. I thought maybe my prayers were too small, that heaven had turned its face from me, but you're here. You're here." She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob, shoulders shaking. Don't let me believe this is a dream." Jonah wanted to move, to rise, to put distance between them before he broke completely. Yet Samuel's weight against him was like a tether he couldn't sever. The child shifted in his sleep, sighing contentedly, whispering in a dream-filled murmur, "Papa." The word burrowed into Jonah's bones, and he felt his resistance collapsing. This widow and her boy had lost a man they believed he was. He had lost a family he never thought he'd have. Fate, or perhaps Providence, had twisted the night so that their broken pieces had collided, and now Jonah couldn't tell where their sorrow ended and his began. He cleared his throat, voice hoarse. "Ma'am," he began, trying to lace the words with caution, "I've been gone a long while, it's true. The years, they don't always give a man choice in where his feet take him." He stopped there, aware how dangerous even those vague words were, but Ruth clutched at them as though they were scripture itself. Her tears spilled freely. She crossed the small space between them, kneeling by his side, her hand hovering near his arm but never quite daring to rest upon it. "Did you suffer? Did you lose yourself out there? I pictured 1,000 horrors, Jonah. That you were taken, that you were buried where no one could mark your grave. That maybe," her voice broke, "maybe you forgot us." Jonah's mouth tightened. He felt the weight of her trust crushing him because he could see in her eyes that she needed to believe this reunion was divine. He should have spoken truth then and there. He should have torn the wound open before it healed wrong. Yet Samuel stirred once more, pressing closer, and Jonah's arms, by some instinct he couldn't fight, curled gently around the boy. He hadn't held anyone like this in 20 years. His heart was not built strong enough to let go. Ruth wept quietly, her sobs muffled against her hand. "I don't care what's behind us," she said finally, her voice trembling but fierce. "If the Lord has given you back to us, then I'll never let go again, not ever." She raised her tear-streaked face to his, and her eyes, shimmering with both hope and fear, locked onto him like chains he couldn't break. "Tell me, Jonah, tell me you've come home." Jonah's chest burned. His tongue pressed against the words that wanted to confess it all, but when his lips parted he found himself nodding instead, whispering the one word that might condemn him. "Home." Ruth broke into sobs of relief, burying her face into her hands as though a great weight had lifted. Samuel murmured something in his sleep, and Jonah's heart wrenched with both guilt and longing. He had just stepped into a story he couldn't escape. The storm raged on outside, but the fire in the hearth burned low as the hours passed. Ruth moved about the small room with the careful grace of a woman who had learned to carry burdens silently. She fetched extra blankets and laid them by the fire. Jonah insisted he could sleep in the barn, but she shook her head fiercely. "Not tonight. Not after all this time. You stay here where Samuel can see you in the morning." Her words struck him harder than the storm's winds. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't know the truth, but he saw the trembling in her hands as she smoothed Samuel's hair, and he swallowed his protest. Instead, he lowered himself carefully onto the blanket she spread near the fire. It wasn't his home. It wasn't his family. But as Samuel stirred once more, whispering "Papa" with a smile even in sleep, Jonah felt as though he had stepped into a dream too fragile to wake from. He lay awake long after Ruth had retired to her small room. The storm rattled the windows, the wind howled through the eaves, but all Jonah could hear was the boy's steady breathing and the echo of Ruth's words, "Tell me you've come home." His guilt gnawed at him, but for the first time in decades, he felt the warmth of belonging pressing against him, even if it was built on a foundation of mistaken identity. As dawn crept in with gray light filtering through the shutters, Jonah stirred from his uneasy rest. The storm had passed, leaving the air damp and heavy with the smell of wet earth. Samuel was already awake, crouched near the hearth, poking at the embers with a stick. His face lit up the moment he saw Jonah move. "Papa, you're still here." The joy in his voice was so pure Jonah couldn't bear to correct him. He forced a smile, nodding slowly. "I'm here, son." The word slipped out before he could stop it, and Samuel's grin widened until Jonah thought his heart might split clean in two. Ruth emerged quietly, her hair still damp from washing, her eyes swollen from weeping but her expression softer than the night before. She paused in the doorway, watching the two of them together, her hand pressed over her chest as though she feared her heart might burst. Jonah looked up and their eyes met, and in that silent moment he saw the depth of her hope. He was no longer just a man caught in a storm. He was the answer to her prayers, the father her boy had begged for in his sleep, the husband she thought the earth had swallowed. And Jonah realized with a jolt of fear that the truth would not only shatter them, it might destroy them. "Breakfast will be ready soon," Ruth said softly, almost shyly, as though she were learning her own voice again. "I saved the last of the eggs for you." Her kindness nearly drove him to his knees. He hadn't tasted warmth like that since his mother had passed. He nodded mutely, unable to form words, and Samuel pulled him toward the table eagerly, chattering about the chores they could do together now that he was home. Jonah sat, listening with a mix of dread and wonder. Each word from Samuel's lips was another strand binding him to this life that wasn't his. He knew he couldn't let it continue, not without sinning against truth itself. But every time Ruth looked at him with that trembling, tear-streaked hope, and every time Samuel called him Papa, Jonah found the courage to confess slipping further and further from his grasp. He had thought the storm was the greatest danger that night. But now, Jonah Carver realized the real storm had only just begun, the storm inside his own heart, where longing, guilt, and a dangerous kind of love clashed like thunder across a broken sky. And before the day was done, someone outside that little home would test the fragile lie he had stumbled into. Because not every man stays buried in the earth as long as folks believe. The morning sun had barely burned through the mist when the first knock came at the door. It was sharp, purposeful, and it sent a chill straight down Jonah's spine. He was sitting at the table, Samuel perched beside him, proudly shoving a slice of bread into his mouth while talking about teaching his papa how to fish in their creek. Ruth was at the stove, humming softly, her hand lingering on the handle of the skillet as though even the ordinary act of cooking had been restored to her heart because Jonah had come home. But the knock silenced everything. The boy stopped mid-bite. Ruth froze with her hand tight around the pan, and Jonah's pulse began to hammer. The knock came again, louder, impatient. Ruth's face went pale, her lips parting in something like dread. She glanced toward Jonah, her eyes wide, before setting the pan down with shaking fingers. "Stay here," she whispered. Her steps were slow and hesitant as she moved to the door, her hands brushing nervously over her skirt before she lifted the latch. The door opened, and the cold air slipped in, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and horse sweat. On the porch stood a man with a lean, hard face, his coat still dripping from travel, his hat shadowing eyes sharp as broken glass. Jonah's gut tightened the moment he saw him. This wasn't a neighbor. This wasn't someone who had come with goodwill. The man's gaze flicked past Ruth into the house, scanning quickly until it landed on Jonah sitting at the table. His lips curled into a smile that was anything but warm. "Well now," the stranger drawled, his voice edged with mockery. "Ain't this a sight I never thought I'd live to see? Jonah Carver sittin' pretty in another man's chair." The words hit Jonah like a lash. His muscles locked, and Samuel, sensing the shift in the air though he couldn't understand it, pressed close to him, clutching his sleeve. Ruth's face crumpled as if she'd been struck. Her eyes darted from the man at the door to Jonah at the table, her mouth opening soundlessly before she whispered, What are you saying?" The stranger chuckled darkly, stepping inside without invitation. His boots thudded against the floor, dragging in mud with every step. "I'm sayin' the grave don't spit out its dead, lady. And whatever tale this one's been spinning, it ain't the truth. Jonah Carver don't belong to you. He don't belong here at all." Jonah rose slowly from his chair, his hand instinctively resting on Samuel's shoulder as though shielding the boy from the poison dripping from the man's words. He didn't know this stranger, but the man clearly knew him, or at least knew of him. And worse, the widow was staring at Jonah now, not with joy but with a dawning terror that made his stomach twist. Ruth's voice shook. You're lying. She turned to Jonah, her eyes pleading. Tell me he's lying. Jonah's chest constricted. Every nerve screamed for him to speak the truth at last, to cut the lie clean and spare them the agony of this stranger's cruelty. But Samuel's hand tightened around his, and the boy's wide eyes looked up at him with unshakable faith. Papa, you finally came back. That voice echoed inside Jonah's mind, clashing against his guilt until he felt torn in two. The stranger's grin widened as he watched Jonah's silence. Don't got much to say now, do ya? Thought you could slip in, warm yourself by her fire, steal a place that ain't yours. But lies got a way of rottin', Carver, and you ain't no ghost come back from the dead. You're just a lonely rancher who lost his way. Ruth swayed on her feet, gripping the doorframe as though to steady herself. Her breath came fast, ragged, her tears spilling. Is it true? She whispered. Jonah, is it true? Jonah opened his mouth, but nothing came. Every word tangled in his throat, caught between Samuel's trust and Ruth's desperation. He should have spoken. He should have confessed. But before he could form the words, Samuel darted in front of him, planting himself defiantly between Jonah and the stranger. You're wrong, the boy shouted, his small fists clenched. This is my papa. He came back to us just like Mama said he would. You're lying. The innocence and ferocity of Samuel's voice froze the room. For a moment, even the stranger looked taken aback. But then he laughed, a cruel, rasping sound. Poor kid. Don't even know his own father's bones are layin' cold under the dirt. And here you are, clinging to a man too broken to tell you the truth. He turned his sneer back to Jonah. You best set this right, Carver, before you ruin them worse than they already been ruined. Jonah's fists clenched at his sides. His shame burned like fire under his skin, but when Samuel's small hand reached back for him again, Jonah couldn't move. Couldn't break the boy's heart with the truth. Not now, not in front of a man who would savor their pain. Get out, Jonah growled, his voice low and dangerous. The stranger's eyebrows rose in amusement. So the ghost's got some teeth after all. He tipped his hat mockingly toward Ruth. Lady, you believe what you want, but this man ain't who you prayed for, and one day you'll see it clear. He turned and strode out, leaving the door swinging wide and the chill rushing in behind him. Ruth slammed it shut, her back pressing hard against the wood, her shoulders shaking. The room was silent except for Samuel's ragged breathing. Slowly, the boy turned to Jonah, his little face flushed with defiance and fear. Don't listen to him, Papa. He doesn't know anything. Ruth's eyes, however, told another story. She stared at Jonah, her face streaked with tears, her voice breaking as she whispered, Tell me, Jonah, please. Tell me it isn't true. Jonah's heart ached so violently he thought it might stop. He wanted to fall to his knees and confess it all, beg forgiveness, and flee before their love shattered. But Samuel was there, clinging to him, and Ruth's hope was still trembling on the edge of collapse. He swallowed hard, his silence damning him even as it kept them from breaking entirely. I'm here, he said at last, his voice thick with both guilt and yearning. That's all that matters right now. I'm here. Ruth covered her mouth, torn between relief and suspicion, between the miracle she longed to believe and the fear that her world was built on sand. Jonah reached for Samuel, pulling him close, and in that fragile embrace, he felt both the weight of his lie and the terrifying truth. He didn't know if he had the strength to ever let go. But outside, the stranger was mounting his horse, his cruel smile lingering in the rain-washed morning. He had seen what Jonah feared most. That truth was a storm waiting just beyond the horizon, and storms never stayed away forever. The hours after the stranger's visit passed in a haze of unease. Ruth moved about the house with a stiffness that hadn't been there before, as though every step cost her something. She answered Samuel's questions with a smile that never reached her eyes, and when Jonah tried to catch her gaze, she looked away. The fragile trust she had clung to was now teetering on the edge, and Jonah knew it. He could feel the storm within her, the war between her heart that longed to believe and her mind that whispered betrayal. Samuel, too young to sense the full weight of what had been said, clung tighter than ever to Jonah. He followed him to the woodpile, insisted on carrying sticks though they were too heavy, and sat beside him when Jonah mended a broken chair leg in the corner. "I'll help you, Papa," he said proudly, his small fingers fumbling with nails. Jonah let him, each stumble of the boy's hand carving deeper into his soul. He was no father, yet Samuel's joy made him feel like one. And the more Jonah let the boy call him Papa, the more he feared he was digging a hole he'd never be able to climb out of. By midday, Ruth finally spoke. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it cut sharper than any blade. "Jonah, tell me about the war." Jonah's breath caught. He hadn't fought in the war. He had been too young when it began and too isolated on his ranch to be pulled into the fighting later. But her husband, whoever he was, surely had. He could see it in her eyes. She was searching for the proof she needed, a story only her true husband could tell. His silence dragged too long. Ruth's shoulders stiffened. "You were gone so long," she continued, her voice trembling, "and I told myself you'd been taken or lost in battle or carried off far where no one could find you. I never believed you had abandoned us. I wouldn't, not when Samuel still looked for you every day." She lifted her eyes, brimming with tears. "So tell me, Jonah, tell me where you were." Jonah's chest tightened until he thought his ribs might crack. This was the moment, the one he had dreaded since stepping across her threshold. The truth lay heavy on his tongue, begging to be spoken. He had to tell her. He had to break this lie before it crushed them all. But Samuel looked up at him with absolute faith, clutching the hammer in his little hands like he was helping to rebuild more than a chair. He was rebuilding his family. "Papa," the boy said softly, waiting. Jonah's throat closed, his voice rasped when it came. "I was lost." He didn't meet Ruth's eyes as he spoke. "Lost in the wilderness, cut off from all I knew. I wandered too far and the years slipped by. I ain't the same man who left, Ruth, but I found my way back." Ruth's tears spilled freely. She pressed her hands to her mouth, a sob shaking her body. His lie had given her relief, but Jonah felt nothing but a greater weight pressing down on him. Samuel smiled brightly, as though the words had mended everything, and threw his arms around Jonah's waist. "I knew it," he whispered fiercely. "I knew you'd come back." Jonah held the boy, guilt gnawing his insides raw. He had spoken words that did not belong to him, claimed years that were never his. And yet, Ruth's sobs softened into quiet weeping, her shoulders shaking with both pain and hope. She wanted to believe, and he had given her reason to. That night Jonah couldn't sleep. He lay on the blanket by the fire, staring at the dark rafters above, listening to the quiet creak of the old house. His thoughts were loud, accusing, unrelenting. Every word of his lie played back in his mind, each one another nail sealing him into a coffin of deceit. He rose quietly, stepping outside into the cool night air. The moon had broken through the clouds, silver light washing over the fields. The earth smelled of rain, clean and raw, as though the storm had swept it bare. Jonah walked to the edge of the porch, gripping the railing until his knuckles whitened. "Lord," he whispered, his voice raw, "what am I doing? These people don't belong to me. I don't deserve their hope. I ain't their husband, I ain't his father, and yet I can't walk away." His voice cracked. "I've been alone so long, and this boy, this woman, they look at me like I'm something worth praying for. If I tell em truth, I'll break em. If I keep quiet, I'll damn us all. Show me the path, Lord. I can't see it myself." A soft creak behind him made him spin. Ruth stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled around her shoulders, her hair loose from sleep. Her eyes glistened in the moonlight, and Jonah knew she had heard. "You're not him, are you?" she whispered. Jonah's chest clenched. His silence answered for him. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth, her knees trembling. "Dear God," her tears fell freely. She staggered to the porch rail, clutching it as though the earth had dropped away beneath her. "You're not my husband." Jonah bowed his head, shame coursing through him. "No, ma'am," he said hoarsely. "I ain't." Her sob split the night, sharp and wounded. She turned from him, covering her face with both hands. Why would you do this?" "I didn't mean to," Jonah said, his voice rough. "The storm drove me here. Your boy, he looked at me like I was his whole world. I should have told the truth right then, but I ain't had the strength. I ain't had the heart to tear it away from him." Ruth shook her head violently, her sobs racking her body. "You don't understand what you've done. I let myself believe that God had given me back the man I buried, and all this time you were a stranger." Jonah's chest burned with her words. He wanted to reach for her, to beg her forgiveness, but he knew his touch would only deepen her hurt. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never meant to harm you, I swear it." Ruth's tears glistened in the moonlight as she turned her face toward him, her voice trembling with fury and sorrow. "You broke us again. Samuel, he won't survive another loss." Jonah's heart clenched. He could bear her hatred, but the thought of Samuel's heartbreak was unbearable. "I won't leave him," Jonah vowed, his voice low and steady. "I'll stay till he don't need me no more. I'll give him what he prayed for, even if I ain't his blood." Ruth shook her head, torn between her rage and the desperation of a mother who had seen her son smile again for the first time in years. Her tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "You'll tear us apart." Jonah's reply was soft, yet heavy as stone. "Or I'll hold you together till you're strong enough to let me go." The silence that followed was thick with grief and fragile hope. The night air pressed around them, the field stretching endlessly into the dark. Ruth turned away, her sobs quieting into broken breaths. Jonah stood frozen, torn between stepping closer and giving her space. He had spoken the truth at last, but it had come too late, and the damage was already done. And as Ruth wiped her tears, her eyes lifting to the horizon, she whispered words that chilled Jonah to the bone. "He'll come back for us. The man who left us for dead. He'll come, and now you'll be caught in it too." Jonah's breath caught. Her husband had not died by nature's hand. He had been driven away, abandoned them, and Ruth had buried her grief in the belief he was gone forever. But she knew better. She knew a storm was coming, not from heaven, but from a man still walking the earth. And Jonah realized with dawning dread that his lie had placed him squarely in the path of that reckoning. The words Ruth spoke that night burned in Jonah's chest long after she had gone inside. "He'll come back for us." They haunted him, twisting through the dark like the wind that howled across the plains. Jonah had thought his lie was the storm, the thing that would ruin them, but now he understood it was only the spark. A greater fire was coming, one carried on the boots of the man who had walked away from them once before. And Jonah Carver, a lonely rancher who had stumbled into the wrong house, now found himself standing where another man should have been when the reckoning came. The following days settled into a fragile rhythm, though the air in the house was as brittle as glass. Ruth barely spoke to Jonah, except when Samuel was present, and even then her words were careful, guarded. She cooked, she cleaned, she moved about the house as though he were no more than a shadow she tolerated for the boy's sake. But her eyes never let him rest. They burned with betrayal, with fury, and with the deeper ache of a woman who had believed in a miracle only to find herself broken once again. Samuel, by contrast, clung to Jonah as though nothing had changed. He dragged him outside at dawn, insisting Jonah show him how to hold an axe, though the boy was far too small. He begged Jonah to tell him stories at night, sitting wide-eyed at his knee as the fire crackled low. He laughed with a joy so unburdened that Jonah sometimes forgot the weight pressing on his own heart, until he caught Ruth watching from the shadows, her expression reminding him that every laugh stolen was another wound when the truth finally shattered. Jonah tried to leave. Twice he saddled his horse before dawn, intending to ride away, to spare them the pain of holding on to a man who didn't belong. Both times Samuel had woken early and come running barefoot through the yard, calling out, "Papa, don't go." The sound of the boy's voice, frantic, pleading, certain, crushed Jonah's resolve, and he unsaddled the horse with shame gnawing at his gut. Each time Ruth had stood silently in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She didn't stop him, but she didn't beg him to stay either. Her silence was worse than any curse, because Jonah could feel her hatred battling her need. On the fourth day, riders came. Jonah was out by the woodpile with Samuel when the sound of hooves carried over the damp morning air. 4 horses crested the rise, their riders hunched with purpose, dust clinging to their coats. Samuel's chatter died instantly, his small hand gripping Jonah's sleeve. The boy's instincts were sharp, too sharp for his age. He knew trouble when he heard it. Ruth came to the porch, her face blanching as the men drew closer. Jonah read the truth in her eyes before she spoke a word. These weren't neighbors. These weren't friends. These were wolves who had circled before. The lead rider, a thick-shouldered man with a scar that split his cheek in 2 jagged lines, reined in his horse at the gate. His eyes fixed on Ruth with a familiarity that made Jonah's stomach knot. His grin was cruel, his voice sharper still. Well, if it ain't the widow who wouldn't stay buried with her sorrow. His gaze slid to Jonah, measuring him with slow disdain. And she's picked herself up another man already. Thought your husband's ghost had enough bite to scare off strays, but I reckon I was wrong. Ruth stiffened, her voice trembling as she replied, "You've no right to be here." The scarred man laughed, swinging down from his horse with heavy boots that struck the earth like gunshots. "I've every right, darlin'. You remember the debt. You remember who it is that's owed. Ain't no grave deep enough to hide it." Samuel pressed closer to Jonah, whispering in terror, "Papa." Jonah's hand instinctively rested on the boy's shoulder, his other tightening into a fist. He didn't know the full story, but he knew enough. Ruth's past wasn't buried in grief alone. It was tied to men like these, men who had preyed on her loss. And Jonah, though he was no husband, no father, found himself standing in the place of both. "Leave," Jonah said, his voice low, steady. "You've said your piece. Now ride on." The scarred man's grin widened, cruel and amused. "You got stoned, stranger, but you ain't got a clue. This woman and her boy are marked. Her man left her in debt so deep no prayers'll wash it clean. And if he ain't here to pay, then she will. Unless," his eyes flicked to Jonah, lingering with malice, "unless you're fool enough to pay it for her." Ruth's face twisted with pain, shame spilling in her eyes. She hadn't wanted Jonah to know. She hadn't wanted Samuel to hear. But the truth was out now, sharp as a blade. Jonah stepped forward, placing himself between Ruth and the scarred man. "I don't know what you think you're owed, but you'll take nothing from this house. Not her, not the boy." The men on horseback shifted, their hands drifting to their holsters, their horses snorting restlessly. The scarred man laughed again, but there was no warmth in it, only threat. "You playin' husband now, you playin' father." He leaned closer, his voice a hiss. "You ain't either. You're just a lost fool who wandered into the wrong storm, and when it breaks, it'll drown you too." Ruth's breath hitched, tears glimmering in her eyes as she whispered, "Jonah, don't." But Jonah couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Samuel's small body pressed into his side, trusting him, believing in him. "Ride on," Jonah said again, steel in his voice. "Before the storm you bring swallows you instead." For a long, tense moment the yard was silent except for the restless horses. Then the scarred man spat into the dirt, his eyes narrowing. "Fine, but this ain't over. We'll be back. And next time, Ghost, you won't be standin' so tall." He swung into his saddle, jerking his reins. The other men followed, their eyes lingering with hunger and threat, before they turned and rode back over the rise, dust curling in their wake. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ruth's hands trembled at her sides, her face pale as she stared at Jonah. Samuel buried his face into Jonah's coat, trembling. Jonah held the boy close, his own chest heaving with a storm he couldn't contain. He had stumbled into another man's life, another man's debts, another man's ruin. And now the wolves knew him too. When Ruth finally spoke, her voice was low, broken. You should have left when you had the chance. Jonah met her gaze, his own voice rough with conviction. I ain't leaving. Not while they circle. Not while he's looking at me like I'm the only shield he's got. Ruth's tears spilled over. She turned away, her body shaking with both rage and despair. You'll break him when the truth comes, and God help me, I don't know if I can stop you. Jonah stood rooted in the yard, Samuel clinging to him, his own heart twisting with both fear and resolve. He had come to the wrong house, but now it was his house to defend. He had no claim to them, no right to stand as father or husband. And yet, as the dust settled and the horizon stretched empty once more, Jonah knew one thing with terrifying certainty. He would rather bleed out in the dirt than watch Ruth and Samuel be taken by the shadows of another man's sins. The storm wasn't coming, it was already here. Night fell heavy over the widow's land, cloaking the cabin in silence that felt like the hush before a storm's break. Jonah sat by the fire, Samuel curled in his lap, fast asleep despite the tension that had pressed through the day. Ruth worked quietly at the table, her hands busy mending Samuel's shirt by lamplight, but her eyes strayed often to Jonah. The crackle of the fire was the only sound between them, and it seemed to carry more weight than words ever could. Jonah's chest tightened each time he looked down at Samuel. The boy's small hand rested against his chest as though claiming him, trusting him, loving him with a purity that Jonah knew he didn't deserve. He had spoken half-truths, let the boy believe in a miracle that wasn't his to give. But when he thought of letting go, of leaving Samuel to face the world's cruelty without him, his body recoiled as though the thought itself were sin. Ruth pricked her finger with the needle, sucking in a sharp breath. Jonah looked up at once, but she waved him off, her expression hard. She hadn't forgiven him. Perhaps she never would. And yet she hadn't sent him away. That truth lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable. At last Ruth set her sewing aside, her voice low and trembling. You don't know what kind of fire you've stepped into. Jonah's gaze held her steadily. I'm starting to see. Her hands clenched in her lap. My husband Samuel's father was a man who made promises with his tongue and broke them with his fists. He borrowed from devils and left us to pay the price. When he vanished, I told Samuel he was gone to God. It was easier than telling him his father had abandoned us for the bottom of a bottle and the lies of gamblers. Her voice cracked, her tears shining in the firelight. I buried him in words, Jonah. I buried him so deep I could breathe again. And then you came to the door, and Samuel thought the grave had opened. I almost let myself think so too. Jonah bowed his head, guilt pressing down on him until he felt crushed. I never meant to steal his place, he murmured. I only meant to find shelter from the storm. But your boy, he looked at me like I was everything he'd prayed for, and I ain't had the strength to tear it away. Ruth's lips trembled. You should have told the truth. I know, Jonah admitted, his voice raw. But I'll tell you plain, Ruth. I may not be his father, but I'll stand as one if it kills me. Those men that came riding. They won't lay a hand on you or Samuel while I still draw breath. Her eyes searched him, torn between fury and a dangerous spark of hope. And when the truth breaks his heart, what then? Jonah glanced down at Samuel, brushing a stray curl from his brow. Then I'll be the one to pick him up. 'Cause I'd rather break with him than see him broken by them. Ruth turned her face away, covering her mouth to smother her sob. Jonah didn't move closer. He knew her war was with herself as much as with him. She had lived too long under the weight of lies and lost to trust a man who had brought both back to her doorstep. The next morning, smoke curled on the horizon. Jonah spotted it first as he stepped outside to chop wood. The column rose steady against the pale sky, too close, too deliberate. His stomach tightened. It wasn't a farmer's fire nor a ranch hand clearing brush. This was a signal, a threat. By midday, riders appeared again, 6 this time, not 4. The scarred man led them, his cruel grin wider, his voice louder as he reined in at the gate. Told you we'd be back, Ghost, he called. Time to settle what's owed. Ruth appeared on the porch, pale but defiant, Samuel clutching her skirts. Jonah stepped into the yard, his hat pulled low, his stance steady as stone. "You'll not cross this yard," Jonah said, his voice low but carrying. The scarred man laughed. "You really think you can stand for what ain't yours? You're playing house with another man's wife, another man's boy, another man's debts. This ain't your fight, Carver. Walk away and maybe you'll keep your hide." Jonah's jaw tightened. He didn't reach for his gun yet, but his hand rested near it, steady as a man who had decided his fate. "This house may not have been mine when I walked up to it, but it's mine now. Hers, his, you want it, you'll ride over me first." The men on horseback shifted uneasily. The scarred man sneered, but his eyes flicked warily over Jonah. He had seen something in him before, something that marked Jonah as a man who didn't bluff. "You're a fool," the scarred man spat. "You'll die for nothing." Jonah's gaze didn't waver. Better to die for something that matters than live as a shadow. The standoff stretched long and thin, the air charged, the horses restless. Samuel's small hand clung tighter to Ruth, his eyes wide with terror, yet fixed on Jonah as though he believed with all his soul that his papa could not fall. The scarred man's sneer twisted into a cruel smile. "Then we'll see how much blood you've got to spend." He jerked his reins, signaling his men. They wheeled their horses, retreating back over the rise. Dust billowed in their wake, but Jonah's gut churned with dread. They weren't gone. They were planning, waiting. The storm was only growing darker. That night Ruth confronted him again. Her voice shook with fury as she whispered, "You're making it worse. If you'd never come, they'd never be circling like this." Jonah rose from his chair, his eyes burning with tired fire. "If I hadn't come, they'd have taken you and Samuel already. Don't you see it? They were circling long before me. I didn't bring this storm, I just stepped into it." Her tears spilled as she shook her head. "And when it breaks, Samuel will be left fatherless all over again." Jonah's heart twisted. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Maybe so, but if that's the price for keeping him safe tonight, I'll pay it. 'Cause whether you believe it or not, Ruth, God led me here. Wrong house or not, this is where I'm meant to stand." Her breath caught. For the first time since she'd learned the truth, her eyes softened just a fraction. She whispered, broken and trembling, "Don't make me believe again, Jonah. Don't make me hope." Jonah's voice cracked as he replied, "Then don't hope in me. Hope in the Lord. I'll do my part till he says otherwise." The silence after was heavier than the storm clouds building beyond the hills. Ruth turned away, her shoulders trembling. Samuel stirred in his sleep, murmuring that one word that bound Jonah more tightly than chains, "Papa." And Jonah knew that when dawn came, the wolves would be back. Only this time they wouldn't just test him with words. They would come to take, to break, to bleed. And he would have to decide, once and for all, if the lie he had stumbled into was worth dying for. The dawn was red as fire, bleeding across the horizon like a warning. Jonah stood at the edge of the yard, his rifle slung across his chest, his boots planted firm in the wet soil. The night had given him little rest. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the shutters, every murmur from Samuel in his sleep had kept him awake. He had spent the hours in prayer, whispering to God for strength he did not possess, for wisdom to stand without breaking, and for the boy inside to be spared the wounds Jonah knew too well. Ruth had barely spoken since the last confrontation. She had moved like a ghost through the house, her eyes red, her lips pressed into silence. But when Jonah rose before dawn to check his rifle, she had come to stand beside him. Her hands trembled as she reached to touch his arm, the gesture fleeting but filled with a desperate kind of resolve. "Don't die here," she whispered. And then, softer still, "Please." Jonah had no answer to give her. He simply nodded, his throat too thick for words. Now, as the sun broke fully over the ridge, the sound of hooves thundered on the horizon. Dust rose in a dark line, and Jonah counted them. 8 riders this time, not 6. Twice as many as the first night he'd come to Ruth's door. The scarred man led them, his grin as sharp and merciless as a blade. His men rode with guns strapped across their saddles, their faces grim, eyes fixed on the cabin like wolves scenting prey. Behind Jonah, the door creaked. Samuel slipped out, clutching his mother's hand. The boy's face was pale but fierce, his eyes locked on Jonah with unshakable belief. "You'll stop them, Papa," he said, his voice steady despite his trembling body. "You won't let them take us." Jonah's chest constricted. He wanted to tell the boy the truth one last time, that he was the father he prayed for, that he was just a lonely man who had wandered into the wrong house. But Samuel's faith was stronger than Jonah's doubt, and in that moment, Jonah realized the truth didn't matter as much as the choice he was about to make. Blood or not, he was the boy's father now, because Samuel had chosen him, and Jonah had chosen not to let go. "Go inside," Jonah said softly, his hand brushing Samuel's hair. "Stay close to your mama." "But—" "Now, son." Jonah's voice was firm but gentle, and Samuel obeyed, his small body darting back into the cabin. Ruth lingered, her face pale, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to shed. For a moment, Jonah thought she might speak, but she only gave the faintest nod, as though entrusting him with more than words could hold. Then she closed the door, leaving him alone in the yard. The riders reached the gate, their horses snorting, restless. The scarred man dismounted first, his boots sinking into the mud. He looked Jonah up and down, then spat into the dirt. The yard went still. Even the wind seemed to pause, the only sound the creak of leather and the restless stamping of horses. The scarred man studied Jonah's eyes, searching for weakness, for the bluff of a desperate man. But what he found instead was something else, resolve forged in loneliness, sharpened by years of silence, and now anchored by the fragile thread of love he had stumbled into. "Fine," the scarred man growled. He drew his pistol. The crack of gunfire split the morning. Jonah's rifle roared, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. One rider pitched sideways off his horse, the others scattering in a frenzy of shouts and curses. Gunfire erupted, bullets slamming into the fence, kicking up splinters, thudding into the mud. Jonah dropped to one knee, reloading with swift, practiced hands, firing again and again, each shot deliberate. He was outnumbered, but he fought like a man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Inside the cabin, Samuel pressed against Ruth, tears streaking his face as he listened to the thunder of battle outside. Ruth held him close, whispering prayers through trembling lips, her heart breaking with every gunshot, torn between terror for Jonah's life and the desperate hope that he would hold the line. The fight raged, horses screaming, men shouting, gunfire cracking like lightning. Jonah moved with grim determination, his body burning, his breath ragged. He took a bullet through his arm, the pain blinding, but he gritted his teeth and fired again, dropping another man to the mud. The scarred man pressed forward, fury blazing in his eyes, shouting curses as he drove his men on. At last the yard fell eerily still. Smoke hung heavy in the air, the smell of gunpowder thick. Bodies lay strewn in the mud, groaning, broken, or silent forever. Jonah staggered, blood running down his arm, his chest heaving, but his rifle was still in his hands. The scarred man stood across from him, his pistol empty, his breath ragged. His sneer had faltered, replaced with something Jonah had not seen before: fear. "You ain't him," the scarred man spat, his voice trembling. "But maybe you're worse." Jonah's gaze didn't waver. "I ain't worse. I'm the man who stands. That's all that matters." The scarred man cursed under his breath, then whistled sharp. The remaining riders, wounded and shaken, dragged themselves onto their horses. They retreated in a ragged line, leaving their dead and broken behind. Dust rose once more, carrying their defeat into the distance. Jonah swayed, his vision dimming, but he stayed on his feet until the last horse vanished over the rise. Only then did he lower his rifle, staggering toward the porch. The door burst open. Ruth rushed forward, Samuel at her side, both their faces streaked with tears. Ruth caught Jonah as he stumbled, her arms strong despite her trembling. Jonah. I told you, Jonah whispered, his voice raw. They wouldn't touch you. Samuel's arms wrapped around him, clinging fiercely. Papa, he sobbed, his small body shaking. You didn't leave, you stayed. Jonah's heart cracked open. He pressed his good hand against the boy's back, his voice breaking. I stayed, son, I stayed. Ruth's tears spilled freely, her face pressed against his shoulder. For the first time since she had learned the truth, she let herself hold him, not as a ghost, not as a stranger, but as the man who had chosen to bleed for them. Jonah didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if Samuel would ever learn the full truth, or if Ruth would ever forgive his lie. But in that moment, with the boy's arms around him and the widow's tears soaking his coat, he knew one thing with certainty. The wrong house had become the only home he had ever truly known. And though the storm had passed, Jonah Carver would never walk away again.